The little girl's hands trembled as she stared at the nurse's fingers, searching for something that wasn't there. 7-year-old Arya Dragov sat motionless on the hospital bed, her dark eyes tracking every gesture, every movement, every attempt at communication that fell into the void between her world and theirs. The Mount Sinai Hospital emergency room buzzed with controlled chaos, monitors beeping, voices overlapping, footsteps echoing against sterile floors, but none of it reached her. She had been watching hands for 3 hours now, the paramedics' hands that had pulled her from the wreckage, the doctor's hands that had checked her pulse, the nurse's hands that had tried to comfort her with meaningless gestures. Each pair of hands spoke a language she couldn't understand, a language that left her more isolated with every passing minute. Arya's small fingers remained pressed against her chest, a protective barrier she had built since her father became too busy, too distant, too consumed by his dangerous world to notice her silence. She didn't trust hands anymore. Hands could lie, hands could dismiss, hands could wave her away when she needed attention most. Then the door opened and a new nurse entered. This one moved differently, slower, more deliberate, and when she raised her hands, something extraordinary happened. For the first time in hours, Arya's breathing changed. Welcome to passion and power. Today we're diving into a story that will touch your heart and keep you on the edge of your seat. A deaf child, a powerful mafia boss, and the nurse who changes everything. Comment below where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories. Your support means the world to us, and trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. The attack on the Dragov convoy had been swift and calculated. 3 black SUVs, bulletproof glass, and enough security to protect a head of state. Yet somehow Leonid Volkov's men had found their mark. Not Cassian Dragov himself, who had been deliberately absent for strategic reasons, but the vehicle carrying his most precious cargo. Arya Dragov had been returning from her private tutoring session when the explosion rocked Michigan Avenue. The blast hadn't touched her physically, but the sound, the chaos, the shattering glass had sent her into a catatonic state that no amount of medical intervention could break. Now she sat in the pediatric emergency room of Mount Sinai Hospital, a small figure dwarfed by the institutional bed, her school uniform wrinkled, and her dark hair falling across her face like a protective curtain. The attending physician, Dr. Martinez, had run every test imaginable. Physically, Arya was unharmed. Emotionally, she had retreated so far inward that even her usual minimal communication had ceased entirely. "She hasn't responded to anything, Dana," the head nurse whispered to her colleague near the door. "Not even basic commands. It's like she's completely shut down." Arya's eyes remained fixed on Dana's hands as she spoke, watching the gestures that accompanied her words, gestures that meant nothing to a child who lived in a world of silence. The little girl had learned to read some lips, but stress made even that difficult, and right now, surrounded by strangers in a cold, sterile environment, stress was all she knew. The trauma wasn't from the explosion itself. Arya had experienced her father's dangerous world before, had learned to accept the constant presence of bodyguards and the weight of being Cassian Dragov's daughter. The real trauma was deeper, more personal, years of watching her father's attention slip away, of being managed by tutors and nannies while he disappeared into his empire of shadows. She had become an expert at reading the dismissive wave of his hand when she tried to approach his office. She knew the exact gesture he made when telling his men to handle her needs. She could recognize the specific way his fingers moved when he was on important calls that couldn't be interrupted, not even by his own daughter. Omar, the paramedic who had found her, approached the bed slowly. "Hey there, sweetheart," he said softly, his hands moving in what he hoped were calming gestures. "You're safe now. Can you tell me your name?" Arya's gaze shifted to his hands, studying the movements with intense concentration. She was searching for something familiar, something that would bridge the gap between his world and hers. But his gestures were random, meaningless, the unconscious hand movements of someone who had never needed to communicate without words. Her small hands remained pressed against her chest, fingers intertwined in a protective knot. This was her default position now, a physical manifestation of the emotional walls she had built. She had learned that keeping her hands close meant keeping herself safe from disappointment. from the constant reminder that even her own father couldn't be bothered to learn her language. The hospital's social worker had been called, but Aria's case was complicated by more than just her deafness. The Dragov name carried weight in Chicago, and everyone knew that weight came with danger. Hospital security had been quietly doubled, and there were whispered conversations about federal involvement and witness protection protocols. Dr. Martinez returned with a tablet, hoping technology might succeed where human connection had failed. He showed Aria pictures, simple drawings of emotions, basic communication symbols. She looked at the screen with the same detached interest she might show a television program in a language she didn't understand. "We need to reach her somehow," Dr. Martinez murmured to Dana. "Her vitals are stable, but this level of withdrawal in a child her age, it's concerning." What they didn't understand was that Aria's withdrawal wasn't new. It had been building for years, brick by brick, every time her father chose his phone over her attempts to communicate, every time he nodded absently while she tried to show him something important, every time he delegated her care to someone else because he was too busy to learn what she needed. The explosion had simply been the final straw, a reminder that even in moments of genuine danger, she was alone. Outside in the hallway, Yuri paced with the controlled tension of a man accustomed to violence, but helpless in the face of a child's pain. Cassian's head of security had been with the Dragov family for 8 years, had watched Aria grow from a toddler into this silent, guarded little girl. He knew the boss would arrive soon, and he dreaded that moment almost as much as he had dreaded making the phone call to report the attack. Cassian Dragov was not a man who handled helplessness well. The clock on the wall ticked past 4 p.m. Aria had been at the hospital for over 3 hours, and still no one had managed to reach her. She continued her vigilant observation of hands, searching for something that wasn't there, waiting for a language that no one in that room could speak. Then footsteps echoed in the hallway, measured, confident, different from the hurried pace of hospital staff. Aria's head turned slightly toward the sound, some instinct telling her that her world was about to change again. Lena Brooks had been finishing her shift in the trauma unit when Dana's urgent page reached her. "Pediatric emergency, non-responsive deaf child, need ASL specialist immediately." The message was brief, but Lena understood the urgency. In her 5 years at Mount Sinai, she had become the go-to nurse for deaf patients, though cases involving children were rare. She made her way to the pediatric wing, her mind already shifting into the careful patient mode required for traumatized children. Lena had learned long ago that her deafness could be either a barrier or a bridge. It all depended on how she chose to use it. The scene in room 314 was exactly what she had expected. A small child surrounded by well-meaning adults who couldn't reach her. Aria sat rigidly on the bed, her dark eyes moving constantly between the faces around her, searching for something that clearly wasn't there. Lena paused in the doorway, taking in the full picture. The child's body language spoke volumes, shoulders hunched defensively, hands pressed protectively against her chest, feet tucked under her as if ready to flee. This wasn't just medical trauma. This was a child who had learned not to trust the world around her. "How long has she been like this?" Lena asked Dana, her voice quiet enough not to startle the little girl. 3 hours. She hasn't responded to anything. We've tried pictures, simple gestures, even brought in a tablet with communication apps. Nothing. Lena nodded, her eyes never leaving Aria. She could see the intelligence in the child's gaze, the way she tracked movement and analyzed faces. This wasn't cognitive impairment. This was emotional shutdown. Moving slowly, Lena approached the bed. She didn't reach out, didn't try to touch or crowd the child's space. Instead, she simply positioned herself where Aria could see her clearly and raised her hands to a comfortable signing position. The change in Aria was immediate but subtle, a slight straightening of her posture, a sharpening of focus in her eyes. She was still guarded, still defensive, but something had shifted. "Hi," Lena signed, her movements clear and deliberate. "I'm here." Aria's breath caught. Her eyes widened slightly, and for the first time in hours, her hands moved away from her chest, not far, just enough to show that she was processing what she was seeing. Lena continued signing, keeping her messages simple and spaced apart. "My name is Lena. I work here. You're safe." The little girl's response was barely perceptible, a tiny nod, more reflex than conscious communication. But it was something. "What's your name?" Lena signed. Aria's hands remained still, but her eyes never left Lena's fingers. She was clearly understanding, but trust would take time. Lena had worked with enough traumatized children to know that communication was only the first step. Dr. Martinez and Dana watched in fascination as this silent conversation unfolded. They couldn't understand the signs, but they could see the change in their patient, the way her rigid posture had softened slightly, the way her breathing had become less shallow. "She's responding, Doctor," Martinez whispered. Lena held up a hand without looking away from Aria, a gentle signal for quiet. Too much attention, too much pressure could cause the child to retreat again. "Are you hurt?" Lena signed. This time Aria did respond, a small shake of her head. "Progress." "Are you scared?" A longer pause, then a barely perceptible nod. Lena's heart tightened. She could see so much in this child's eyes. Intelligence, wariness, and a deep, bone-deep loneliness that no 7-year-old should carry. "That's okay," she signed. "Being scared is okay." For the first time, Aria's hands moved in what might have been the beginning of a sign, but then she caught herself and pressed them back against her chest. The gesture was so quick, so automatic, that it spoke of long practice in self-protection. Lena recognized the pattern. This child had learned to hide her needs, to make herself small and undemanding. Someone had taught her, probably unintentionally, that her attempts at communication were unwelcome. The sound of heavy footsteps in the hallway interrupted the moment. Aria's entire body tensed, and her eyes darted toward the door with an expression that was part anticipation, part dread. Lena turned to follow the child's gaze, just as the door opened with more force than necessary. The man who entered commanded immediate attention, not just because of his imposing physical presence, but because of the aura of controlled danger that surrounded him like a second skin. Cassian Dragov was exactly what Lena had expected, and nothing like what she had prepared for. Tall and broad-shouldered, he wore a perfectly tailored black suit that probably cost more than her monthly salary. His dark hair was impeccably styled despite the obvious haste of his arrival, and his pale blue eyes swept the room with the calculating precision of a man accustomed to assessing threats. But it was the details that caught Lena's attention. The way his white dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, revealing both the strong column of his throat and a hint of what looked like a tattoo. The expensive watch on his wrist caught the fluorescent light as he moved, and there was something about his entire bearing that suggested violence held carefully in check. Yuri followed him into the room, along with 2 other men who positioned themselves near the door with the casual alertness of professional security. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Cassian's eyes found his daughter immediately, and Lena saw something flicker across his face. Relief, yes, but also something that looked almost like helplessness. It was gone so quickly she might have imagined it. "How is she?" he asked, his voice carrying a slight accent that spoke of Russian heritage. His eyes moved to Dr. Martinez, then to Dana, and finally to Lena. When his gaze settled on her, she felt the full weight of his scrutiny. "Physically unharmed," Dr. Martinez replied carefully, "but she's been unresponsive since the incident. This is Lena Brooks, our ASL specialist. She's the first person Aria has shown any reaction to." Cassian's attention focused entirely on Lena now, and she found herself being evaluated with an intensity that was both uncomfortable and strangely compelling. She could practically see him cataloging details, her hospital ID badge, her professional demeanor, the way she positioned herself protectively near his daughter. "You can communicate with her," he said. It wasn't a question. "Some," Lena replied honestly. "She's responding to basic signs, but she's very guarded. This level of withdrawal suggests trauma that goes beyond today's incident." Something dangerous flashed in Cassian's eyes at her words, but his voice remained controlled. "What kind of trauma?" Lena chose her words carefully. "Emotional isolation. She's learned not to trust that her attempts at communication will be welcomed or understood." The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Cassian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and Lena realized she had just delivered a diagnosis that hit closer to home than he was comfortable with. Arya had been watching this entire exchange with growing tension. Her father's presence always brought this kind of energy, important conversations that happened around her rather than with her, decisions made about her life without her input. Lena turned back to the little girl and signed, "That's your dad." Arya nodded, but there was no joy in the gesture, no relief at seeing her father. Just acknowledgement. "He was worried about you," Lena continued. This time Arya's response was more complex, a slight tilt of her head that seemed to say she wasn't entirely convinced. Cassian had been watching this silent conversation with growing frustration. "What is she saying?" "She's not saying much yet," Lena replied, "but she's listening and she's thinking. I need to know she's all right. She is physically, emotionally." Lena paused, meeting his intense gaze directly. "That's going to take time." The challenge in her voice was subtle but unmistakable. She wasn't intimidated by his reputation or his presence, and Cassian found himself reassessing the woman in front of him. Most people either cowered or tried too hard to impress him. Lena Brooks was doing neither. "How much time?" he asked. "However long it takes." Their eyes held for a moment longer than necessary, and Lena felt something shift in the air between them. Not attraction exactly, but a kind of recognition. They were both people who understood that some things couldn't be rushed or forced. Arya watched this exchange with the sharp attention of a child who had learned to read adult dynamics for signs of danger or dismissal. What she saw confused her. Her father, who never had time for long conversations about her needs, seemed to be taking this woman seriously. The moment was interrupted by Yuri's quiet voice from near the door. "Boss, we should discuss security arrangements." Cassian nodded curtly, but his eyes remained on his daughter. "She stays here tonight." "For observation, yes," Dr. Martinez confirmed. "But given the circumstances, we'll need to coordinate with—" "I'll handle security," Cassian cut him off. His gaze moved to Lena. "Will you be working tonight?" "I can arrange to stay," Lena replied, understanding the unspoken request. "If that's what's best for Arya." "It is." The certainty in his voice brooked no argument, but Lena found herself responding to the underlying concern rather than the commanding tone. This was a father who was out of his depth, trying to protect a child he didn't know how to reach. As the adults continued their quiet discussion of logistics and security, Arya made a decision. Slowly, carefully, she lifted one small hand and signed a single word toward Lena. "Stay." It was the first word she had spoken in any language since the attack, and it carried the weight of a child's desperate hope that maybe, finally, someone would understand. The night shift at Mount Sinai brought a different energy, quieter hallways, dimmed lights, and the kind of focused calm that allowed for deeper conversations. Lena had arranged to stay through the night, officially to monitor Arya's progress, but privately because she couldn't shake the image of the little girl's desperate stay sign. Arya had finally fallen asleep around 10 p.m., but it was a restless sleep punctuated by small movements and occasional whimpers. Lena sat in the chair beside the bed, catching up on patient notes while keeping one eye on her young charge. The sound of approaching footsteps made her look up. Cassian Dragov appeared in the doorway, his earlier entourage notably absent. He had removed his suit jacket, and his white shirt was now rolled up at the sleeves, revealing strong forearms and making him look slightly less intimidating, though no less dangerous. "How is she?" he asked quietly, stepping into the room. "Sleeping, finally, but not peacefully." Lena kept her voice low, mindful of the sleeping child. "She's been having what looked like anxiety dreams." Cassian moved closer to the bed, his expression softening as he looked down at his daughter. In sleep, Arya looked even smaller and more vulnerable, her dark hair spread across the pillow and her hands still positioned defensively near her chest. "She always sleeps like that," he said, more to himself than to Lena. "Like she's protecting herself even in her dreams." The observation was more perceptive than Lena had expected, and she found herself reassessing the man beside her. How long has she been doing that? Since she was about 4. Cassian pulled the visitor chair closer to the bed and sat down heavily. After her mother died. The admission hung in the air between them. Lena had assumed the child's mother was absent, but death added another layer of complexity to Arya's emotional landscape. That's when she became deaf? Lena asked gently. No, she was born deaf. But losing her mother. He trailed off, running a hand through his hair. I didn't handle it well. Any of it. It was perhaps the most honest thing he had said since arriving at the hospital, and Lena could hear the weight of regret in his voice. Grief affects everyone differently, she said. Children especially need stability and communication during times of loss. Communication. Cassian's laugh was bitter. I never learned to sign, kept telling myself I would, that there was time. Elena, my wife, she was fluent. She handled all of that. And after she died, I hired tutors, nannies, people who could give Arya what I couldn't. He looked at his sleeping daughter with an expression of profound sadness. I told myself I was protecting her by keeping her away from my world, but really, I was protecting myself from having to face how badly I was failing her. The confession was raw and unexpected. Lena had been prepared for a cold, distant father who saw his child as a burden. Instead, she was seeing a man who was painfully aware of his shortcomings and had no idea how to fix them. It's not too late, she said softly. Children are remarkably resilient, and Arya is clearly intelligent. She's been watching, learning, waiting. Waiting for what? For you to see her. Really see her, not just as a problem to be managed or a vulnerability to be protected. Cassian was quiet for a long moment, his eyes never leaving his daughter's face. Today, when I got the call about the attack, all I could think about was that I might lose her before I ever really knew her. What stopped you from learning to sign before now? The question was direct, and Lena half expected him to deflect or shut down. Instead, he seemed to consider it seriously. Fear, I think. Fear that I'd be bad at it, that I'd disappoint her even more than I already have. In my world, showing weakness gets you killed. But with Arya, he shook his head. Everything I know about power and control is useless. Parenting isn't about power and control. It's about connection and trust. Two things I'm not exactly known for. Despite the seriousness of the conversation, Lena found herself almost smiling. Maybe it's time to learn some new skills. Arya stirred in her sleep, her small hands moving in what looked like signs. Both adults leaned forward, trying to understand what she might be dreaming about. "Mama," she signed in her sleep, the movement small and heartbreaking. Cassian's entire body tensed, and Lena saw his hands clench into fists. The grief in his expression was so raw that she had to look away. "She still dreams about her," he said quietly. 3 years later, and she still reaches for her mother in her sleep. That's normal, healthy even. It means she's processing the loss, not burying it. I never talked to her about Eleanor. I didn't know how, and I was afraid it would make things worse. Children need to know it's okay to remember, to grieve, to miss the people they've lost. Your silence might have made her think those feelings were wrong. Cassian absorbed this information with the same intensity he probably brought to business negotiations. What else have I done wrong? The question was so blunt, so devoid of defensiveness, that Lena found herself responding with equal honesty. You've treated her like a problem to be solved instead of a person to be known. You've delegated her emotional needs to strangers. You've made her feel like her attempts at communication are inconvenient. She paused, watching his face for signs that she had pushed too far. But you're here now. That matters. Is it enough? That depends on what you're willing to do going forward. Before Cassian could respond, Arya's eyes fluttered open. She looked confused for a moment, taking in the darkened room and the two adults beside her bed. When she saw her father, her expression became guarded again. "Hi, sweetheart," Lena signed, moving into Arya's line of sight. "You're okay. You're safe." Arya nodded, then looked at her father with an expression that was hard to read. Cassian leaned forward slightly, and for a moment, Lena thought he might try to communicate with his daughter. Instead, he simply said, "I'm here." The words were in English, useless to a deaf child, but something in his tone must have conveyed meaning, because Arya's expression softened slightly. "Can you tell her I'm sorry?" Cassian asked Lena. "About today, about the attack, about everything." Lena translated, watching Arya's face carefully. The little girl's response was a small nod, but her eyes remained wary. "She wants to know if you're staying," Lena interpreted as Arya signed. "Tonight, yes, always if she wants me to." When Lena translated this, something shifted in Arya's expression. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was the beginning of hope. The rest of the night passed quietly. Cassian remained in his chair, sometimes dozing, sometimes just watching his daughter sleep. Lena found herself observing both of them, noting the way Arya seemed to sleep more peacefully with her father present, and the way Cassian's entire demeanor changed when he thought no one was watching. The careful way he adjusted her blanket, the gentle expression that replaced his usual mask of control. Around 3 a.m., Arya woke again, this time more alert. She looked around the room, taking in the sleeping forms of the adults, then carefully signed to Lena. "He stayed." "Yes," Lena signed back. "He stayed." "Why?" It was a simple question with a complex answer. Lena glanced at Cassian, who was awake and watching their conversation with intense focus. "Because he loves you," she signed, "even if he doesn't always know how to show it." Arya considered this for a long moment, then signed something that made Lena's heart ache. Does he want to learn? The question was so full of tentative hope that Lena had to swallow hard before translating it for Cassian. His response was immediate and fierce. "Yes, whatever it takes." When Lena interpreted his words, Arya's eyes filled with tears, not of sadness but of something that looked like relief. She signed a single word. "Okay." It was the smallest possible beginning, but as Lena looked between father and daughter, she realized she was witnessing something profound. The first crack in the wall that had stood between them for 3 years. Outside the hospital room, the city of Chicago slept on, unaware that in one small space, a family was taking its first tentative steps toward healing. The morning brought complications that Lena hadn't anticipated. Dr. Martinez arrived early for rounds, followed closely by a woman in an expensive suit who introduced herself as Agent Sarah Chen from the FBI. The federal investigation into the attack on the Dragov convoy was expanding, and Arya was now considered a potential witness. "We need to interview the child," Agent Chen explained to Cassian, who had returned to his full intimidating presence with the arrival of daylight and official scrutiny. "She may have seen something that could help us identify the perpetrators." "Absolutely not." Cassian's response was immediate and non-negotiable. "She's 7 years old and traumatized. You're not putting her through an interrogation. Mr. Dragov, with respect, this attack was clearly targeted at your family. Your daughter's safety depends on us catching the people responsible." Lena found herself caught in the middle of this standoff, with Arya watching the tense conversation from her hospital bed. The little girl couldn't hear the words being exchanged, but she could read the body language perfectly. The way her father's shoulders had tensed, the way the strange woman kept gesturing toward her, the way everyone seemed to be talking about her rather than to her. "What do they want?" Arya signed to Lena, her small hands moving with increasing agitation. "They want to ask you about yesterday," Lena interpreted carefully. "About what you saw." Arya's response was immediate and emphatic. "No." The single sign carried such force that it drew everyone's attention, even though most of them couldn't understand it. "She doesn't want to talk about it," Lena told the room, "and pushing her right now could cause more psychological damage." Agent Chen looked frustrated. "We have protocols for interviewing child witnesses. We can bring in specialists." "Who don't speak her language," Lena interrupted. "Who don't understand her specific trauma history. You'd be asking her to relive a terrifying experience with complete strangers." Cassian's expression had grown progressively darker throughout this exchange. "The answer is no. Final." "Mr. Dragov, I understand your protective instincts, but you understand nothing." His voice carried a quiet menace that made everyone in the room take a step back. "My daughter has been through enough. She's not your witness. She's not your case study. She's a child who needs to heal." Agent Chen opened her mouth to argue further, but Dr. Martinez intervened. "Perhaps we could discuss this outside the patient's room." As the adults filed out into the hallway, Lena remained with Arya, who had pulled her knees up to her chest and was rocking slightly, a self-soothing behavior that spoke of deep distress. "They want to ask me questions," Arya signed, her movements sharp with anxiety. "Your father said no. He won't let them. But they'll keep trying." The observation was disturbingly perceptive for a 7-year-old, and it reminded Lena that this child had grown up in a world where persistence and pressure were tools of the trade. "Are you afraid of what you might remember?" Lena asked gently. Aria's hands stilled for a moment, then she signed something that broke Lena's heart. "I'm afraid of what I already remember." Before Lena could respond, the door opened and Cassian returned alone. His face was set in hard lines, and there was something in his expression that suggested the hallway conversation hadn't gone well. "They're backing off for now," he said, though his tone suggested it was a temporary victory at best. "But this isn't over." He approached the bed slowly, and for the first time since Lena had met him, he seemed uncertain. "Aria, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." Lena translated, noting the way Aria's posture became even more defensive. "Did you see who attacked the car?" Cassian continued, his voice gentler than Lena had heard it before. Aria's response was immediate and vehement. "I don't want to talk about it." When Lena interpreted this, Cassian nodded. "Okay, you don't have to. Not to them, not to anyone. But if you ever want to tell me, I'm here." The promise seemed to ease some of Aria's tension, but she remained curled in her protective position. "There's something else," Cassian said, and Lena could hear the reluctance in his voice. "The hospital isn't safe anymore. Too many people know you're here, and there are too many ways in and out. We need to move you somewhere more secure." "Where?" Lena asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "My house. It's the only place I can guarantee her safety." The implications of this hit Lena immediately. "I can't leave the hospital indefinitely. I have other patients, responsibilities. She won't go without you." Cassian's statement was matter-of-fact, "and I won't force her to be alone with strangers again." Aria had been following this conversation through Lena's translations, and now she signed something that surprised everyone. "I want Lena to come." The simple request carried enormous weight. This child, who trusted no one, was asking for Lena's continued presence in her life. "It would be temporary," Cassian said, though something in his tone suggested he wasn't entirely certain of that. "Just until we can establish a more permanent arrangement." Lena found herself in an impossible position. Professionally, she knew she should maintain appropriate boundaries. Personally, she couldn't abandon a child who had finally found someone to trust. And practically, she was beginning to understand that refusing might put both her and Aria in danger. "What kind of arrangement?" she asked. "I don't know yet, but I'm learning that my daughter needs things I can't provide alone." The admission clearly cost him something. "Maybe it's time I stopped trying to handle everything by myself." The conversation was interrupted by a commotion in the hallway. Raised voices, the sound of someone arguing with hospital security. Cassian was on his feet immediately, his hand moving instinctively toward his jacket. Yuri appeared in the doorway, his expression grim. "Boss, we have a problem. Someone's been asking questions about the girl. Hospital staff, maintenance workers, anyone who might have access." "Volkov's people?" "Most likely. They're being careful, but they're definitely fishing for information." Aria had been watching this exchange with growing alarm, and now she signed frantically to Lena. "What's happening? Are we in danger?" Lena found herself torn between honesty and reassurance. "Your father is making sure you're safe," she signed back. "But we're not safe here." "No," Lena admitted. "We're not." Cassian had been watching this silent conversation, and something in Aria's body language must have communicated her fear because his expression softened. "We're leaving," he announced. "Now. Yuri, bring the car to the service entrance. Dana, I need discharge papers. Mr. Dragov, I can't discharge a patient without proper medical clearance," Dr. Martinez protested from the doorway. "Then clear her. Medically, she's fine. Emotionally, she'll be better away from here." The authority in his voice brooked no argument, but Lena could see the conflict on Dr. Martinez's face. Hospital protocol versus the reality of a dangerous situation. "I'll take responsibility for her medical care," Lena heard herself saying. "I'm qualified to monitor her condition, and I can coordinate with her regular physicians." It was a commitment that went far beyond anything she had planned, but looking at Aria's frightened face, she knew she couldn't do anything else. Cassian's eyes met hers across the room, and she saw something that might have been gratitude. "Thank you." The next hour passed in a blur of activity. Discharge papers were expedited, security arrangements were made, and Lena found herself packing a bag with items she never thought she'd need. Clothes suitable for staying in a Mafia boss's home, contact information for her supervisor, and a growing sense that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't predict. As they prepared to leave the hospital, Arya reached for Lena's hand, the first voluntary physical contact she had initiated. Her small fingers were cold and trembling, but her grip was determined. "Ready?" Lena signed with her free hand. Arya nodded, though her eyes were wide with apprehension. "Will you stay with me?" "As long as you need me to." It was a promise that Lena hoped she could keep, even as she followed Cassian Dragov and his daughter into a world she was completely unprepared for. The Dragov estate in Lincoln Park was nothing like what Lena had expected. Instead of the ostentatious mansion she had imagined, it was an elegant Georgian-style home that managed to be both imposing and surprisingly warm. The security measures were subtle but comprehensive, cameras hidden among the landscaping, reinforced windows that looked perfectly normal, and guards who blended seamlessly into the background. Arya had fallen asleep in the car during the 20-minute drive, exhaustion finally overcoming her anxiety. Now she lay curled in Cassian's arms as he carried her into the house, her small face peaceful in a way that Lena hadn't seen before. "Her room is upstairs," Cassian said quietly, leading the way through a foyer decorated with understated luxury. "I had it soundproofed when she was younger, not because of the deafness, but because of my work. I didn't want her to accidentally hear things that might frighten her." The consideration in that gesture surprised Lena. For all his emotional distance, Cassian had clearly thought carefully about his daughter's needs, even if he hadn't known how to meet them directly. Arya's bedroom was a study in contrasts. Expensive furniture mixed with clearly well-loved toys, educational books in both English and ASL, and artwork that suggested a child with a vivid imagination. But what struck Lena most was how impersonal it felt, like a beautiful hotel room rather than a space where a child truly lived. "She spends most of her time in here," Cassian explained as he settled Arya on the bed. "The tutors come here. She has her meals here when I'm working. I thought it would make her feel secure." "It made her feel isolated," Lena said gently, then immediately regretted her bluntness. But Cassian just nodded. "I'm beginning to understand that." He pulled a blanket over his sleeping daughter with surprising tenderness, then gestured for Lena to follow him out of the room. "Your room is across the hall," he said, opening a door to reveal a guest suite that was probably larger than Lena's entire apartment. "If you need anything, there's an intercom system, and if Arya needs you during the night—" "I'll hear her," Lena assured him. "I'm a light sleeper, and I've learned to sense movement and vibration." They stood in the hallway for a moment, the weight of the day's events settling between them. In the soft lighting of his home, Cassian looked different, less intimidating, more human. The expensive watch still gleamed on his wrist, and she could still see the hint of tattoo at his collar, but there was something almost vulnerable about him now. "I don't know how to do this," he said suddenly. "Any of it. Being a single father, protecting her from my world while still being part of it, learning to communicate with her. I've been failing at all of it for 3 years. Recognizing the problem is the first step toward fixing it. Is it fixable, or have I damaged things beyond repair?" The question was raw with self-doubt, and Lena found herself responding to the pain in his voice, rather than the intimidating reputation that preceded him. Children are remarkably forgiving, especially when they see genuine effort. Arya loves you. I can see it in the way she watches you, the way she responds when you're near, but she's also learned to protect herself from disappointment. How do I show her that things will be different without just making empty promises? You start small, you learn her language. You spend time with her without distractions. You let her see that she matters more than anything else in your world. Cassian absorbed this advice with the same intensity he brought to everything else. Will you help me? Not just with the signing, but with understanding her. The request was unexpected, and Lena found herself considering not just the professional implications, but the personal ones as well. She was already more involved in this family's life than any nurse should be, and every instinct told her that getting deeper would only complicate things further. But then she thought of Arya's small hand in hers, the way the little girl had finally begun to trust again, and she knew she couldn't walk away. "Yes," she said simply. "I'll help." The relief in Cassian's expression was profound. "Thank you. I know this isn't what you signed up for when you became a nurse." "No," Lena agreed, "it's not. But sometimes the most important work we do is the work we never planned for." They were interrupted by the sound of Arya stirring in her room. Both adults turned toward the door, and Lena was struck by how naturally they had fallen into a shared concern for the little girl's well-being. "She has nightmares sometimes," Cassian said quietly, "about the accident that killed her mother. I never know what to do when she wakes up scared. You go to her. You let her know she's not alone. Sometimes that's enough." As if summoned by their conversation, Arya appeared in her doorway, rubbing her eyes and looking disoriented. When she saw both adults in the hallway, her expression became uncertain. "Bad dream," Lena signed. Arya nodded, then looked at her father with an expression that was part hope, part expectation of disappointment. Cassian seemed to understand that this was a test of sorts. He approached his daughter slowly, then knelt down to her level, something Lena suspected he rarely did. "It's okay," he said aloud, then looked helplessly at Lena. "How do I tell her she's safe?" Lena showed him the signs, watching as he carefully mimicked her movements. His hands were large and somewhat clumsy with the unfamiliar gestures, but there was something deeply moving about seeing this powerful man struggle to communicate with his child in her own language. Arya's eyes widened as she watched her father's attempts at signing. When he finished, she looked between him and Lena with an expression of amazement. "You're learning," she signed to her father, though he couldn't understand her response. "She says you're learning," Lena interpreted. "I want to learn," Cassian replied, and this time he attempted to sign the words as he spoke them. The smile that spread across Arya's face was like sunshine breaking through clouds. For the first time since Lena had met her, the little girl looked genuinely happy. "Can you teach me more?" Arya signed to Lena, but her eyes remained on her father. "Every day," Lena promised, then showed Cassian how to sign the same response. As father and daughter shared their first real conversation in sign language, halting, imperfect, but genuine, Lena realized that she was witnessing something extraordinary. Not just the beginning of communication between a parent and child, but the first steps toward healing years of unintended neglect and misunderstanding. Later that evening, after Arya had been settled back to sleep and Cassian had retreated to his office for what he called unavoidable business, Lena found herself standing at the window of her guest room, looking out at the Chicago skyline. The city lights twinkled in the distance, a reminder of the normal world that seemed increasingly far away. Her phone buzzed with a text from her sister, Mila. "Haven't heard from you since yesterday. Everything okay?" Lena stared at the message, trying to figure out how to explain that she was now living in a Mafia boss's house, caring for his traumatized daughter, and somehow becoming invested in a family that existed in a world she had never imagined being part of. "Everything's complicated," she texted back, "but I'm okay." It wasn't entirely true, but it wasn't entirely false either. She was okay, physically at least. Emotionally, she was navigating territory that had no clear boundaries or established protocols. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find Cassian standing in the hallway, still wearing his white dress shirt, but with the sleeves rolled up and the collar even more open than before. He looked tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. "I wanted to thank you," he said. "For today, for staying, for everything. You don't need to thank me. I'm just doing what's right for Arya." "No, it's more than that. You could have walked away at any point, but you didn't. You chose to help us, even though it meant putting yourself at risk." The acknowledgement of danger was sobering, a reminder that this situation was far from normal or safe. "Is she really in danger?" Lena asked. "Or is this just precautionary?" Cassian's expression grew grim. "Leonid Volkov won't give up easily. He sees Arya as my weakness, and he's not wrong. I would do anything to protect her, give up anything, sacrifice anything. That makes her a powerful weapon against me. And me, am I in danger too? As long as you're important to her, yes. I'm sorry for that. I never intended to drag an innocent person into my world. The honesty was both frightening and oddly comforting. At least he wasn't trying to minimize the risks. What happens next? Lena asked. I eliminate the threat. Permanently. The casual way he said it sent a chill down her spine, a reminder of exactly who she was dealing with. And until then? Until then, we keep her safe. We help her heal. And maybe. He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. Maybe we all learn something about what it means to be a family. The word hung in the air between them, loaded with possibility and danger in equal measure. Lena found herself looking into his pale blue eyes, seeing not the cold calculation she had expected, but something that looked almost like hope. Get some rest, he said finally. Tomorrow we start over, all of us. As he walked away, Lena closed her door and leaned against it, her heart racing with a mixture of fear and anticipation. She had no idea what tomorrow would bring, but she knew that her life had irrevocably changed the moment she had raised her hands and signed to a frightened little girl. Outside her window, Chicago slept on, unaware that in one house in Lincoln Park, 3 people were beginning to discover that sometimes the most unexpected circumstances could lead to the most profound connections. Years later, as Lena watched Aria confidently interpret for a group of deaf students at the community center she had helped establish, she marveled at how much had changed. The frightened 7-year-old who had once stared at strangers' hands in desperate hope had grown into a poised young woman who moved between the hearing and deaf worlds with equal grace. She's remarkable, Cassian said softly, coming to stand beside Lena at the observation window. His hair showed threads of silver now, and the expensive watch on his wrist had been replaced by something more practical. But his eyes still held the same intensity that had first caught her attention in that hospital room. She always was, Lena replied. She just needed someone to see it. The community center had been Cassian's idea, born from his determination to ensure that other deaf children wouldn't experience the isolation that Aria had endured. What had started as a way to atone for his failures as a father had evolved into something much larger, a place where families could learn to communicate, where children could find community, where healing could happen one sign at a time. Aria looked up and caught sight of them through the window. Her face lit up with a smile that still had the power to transform Cassian's entire demeanor, and she signed a quick message. Almost done. Dinner at home? Lena translated automatically, a habit that had become as natural as breathing over the years. Tell her yes, Cassian replied, then added his own signs to the message, still imperfect after all this time, but filled with love that transcended any technical flaws. As they walked home through the Chicago streets, Aria chattering excitedly about her students' progress, Lena reflected on the journey that had brought them all to this point. It hadn't been easy. There had been setbacks, challenges, moments when the weight of Cassian's world had threatened to overwhelm them all. But they had persevered, learned to trust, discovered that love could indeed conquer the deepest fears and the highest walls. Thank you, Cassian said quietly as they reached their front door, the same house where Lena had first stayed as a temporary guest and had somehow never left. For what? For seeing us, for staying, for teaching us that family isn't about blood or obligation, it's about choice. Aria, who had been watching their conversation, added her own message. Thank you for teaching Dad that hands can heal instead of hurt. As they entered their home together, Lena smiled at the truth in those words. Sometimes the most profound transformations began with the simplest gestures. A raised hand, an offered sign, a choice to stay when leaving would have been easier. In the end, they had all learned to speak the same language, love. And that's how love found its way through silence here at Passion and Power. Sometimes the most powerful connections happen without words, and sometimes the strongest families are the ones we choose. Did this story touch your heart? Let us know in the comments which moment moved you the most, and don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories that will keep you coming back for more. Your support means everything to us, and we can't wait to share the next emotional journey with you.